Imagine living every day surrounded by people, with no private bedroom and no door to close. For many prehistoric communities, everyday life probably involved far more shared space than most people experience today.
Does that mean ancient humans had absolutely no privacy? The answer is more complicated than you might expect.
Privacy doesn't necessarily require locked doors, bedrooms, fences, or any of the architecture surrounding us today.
Sometimes gaining privacy could have been as simple as putting physical distance between yourself and everyone else. A short walk could transform a crowded social environment into somewhere considerably quieter and more personal. There was probably a limit, because complete isolation could also mean giving up protection and assistance. For prehistoric humans, personal space could therefore involve balancing solitude against the advantages of remaining near others.
Hunter-gatherer group sizes varied, but people often lived within social networks where familiar individuals repeatedly interacted. In relatively small groups, disappearing completely from social attention may have been difficult for long periods. But physical separation isn't the only possibility. People can also create privacy through learned social boundaries. Sometimes respecting another person's space may require behavior rather than a physical wall separating two people. Human societies can maintain complicated expectations about personal behavior even when those expectations are never written down. And privacy expectations likely differed dramatically between communities, environments, periods, relationships, and individual situations.
That makes one thing important: modern ideas about privacy cannot simply be projected backward into deep prehistory. Unfortunately, privacy leaves far fewer archaeological traces than stone tools, bones, fireplaces, or permanent structures. What researchers can sometimes investigate is how people organized activities across caves, camps, shelters, and settlements. People didn't necessarily perform every activity in exactly the same spot simply because they lived together. Cooking, tool work, resting, food processing, and social activity could occupy different areas depending on the site. Rocks, vegetation, terrain, and shelters could also create visual separation without anything resembling a modern room. Rock shelters and caves could provide naturally divided spaces that open outdoor camps simply didn't possess.
Even without doors, a deeper corner or rock projection could create some separation from other group members. Nighttime, however, probably brought people closer again when safety, warmth, shelter, and available space became priorities.
Living close together doesn't automatically mean humans lacked concepts of boundaries, possessions, relationships, or personal space.
Ancient privacy may have depended less on walls and more on distance, behavior, landscape, relationships, and culture. Some everyday activities naturally required people to move away from the busiest parts of camp. Dense vegetation, large rocks, uneven terrain, and distance could create privacy without constructed walls. Simply moving beyond another person's view may have provided enough separation for certain everyday needs.
Going too far could create unnecessary risks, so complete isolation wasn't always the safest choice.
The farther someone traveled from companions, the farther they also moved from immediate help and collective awareness.
Being watched might sometimes feel inconvenient, but nearby companions could also notice danger or unexpected problems quickly.
Young children probably spent much of their lives close to caregivers and other familiar members of their community. In cooperative communities, childcare could involve social networks extending beyond only one parent and one child. That meant prehistoric childhood may have involved constant opportunities to observe conversations, work, conflict, cooperation, and social rules. Children could also learn when to approach others, when to wait, and when someone wanted space. Personal boundaries are partly cultural, meaning each generation can learn expectations by observing people around them. Privacy isn't only about bodies and spaces. Humans can also care about objects they consider personally important. Hunter-gatherer societies often share extensively, but sharing does not necessarily mean every object belongs equally to everyone. Tools, ornaments, clothing, containers, or other objects could sometimes have particular relationships with specific individuals.
Social rules could determine who used certain objects even when nothing physically prevented somebody else from taking them. This reveals something important: humans don't need fences for boundaries to exist inside their minds. When darkness arrived, however, practical needs could bring everyone physically closer together once again.
Sleeping arrangements probably varied enormously depending on environment, shelter, group composition, season, and available space. Living communally doesn't mean every individual necessarily slept pressed directly against every other member of the group. Sleeping proximity may have reflected relationships, caregiving needs, age, available warmth, and local social customs. Unfortunately, archaeology rarely lets us reconstruct exactly who slept beside whom on an ordinary prehistoric night. Spatial patterns can sometimes reveal activity zones, but interpreting individual privacy from them requires considerable caution. Eventually, something happened that dramatically increased humanity's ability to separate one space from another: architecture. Constructed shelters could create stronger visual boundaries than bushes, rocks, distance, or social expectations alone. Once humans built increasingly substantial homes, privacy could become part of physical space in entirely new ways. Permanent settlements changed daily life because people increasingly lived beside the same neighbors for much longer periods. Living in larger settlements could mean encountering far more people without simply walking away from everyone. At the same time, architecture created something open camps couldn't easily provide: durable visual separation. Crossing into a dwelling could separate household activities from much of the community outside. For Finn, a wall suddenly accomplished what previously required distance, vegetation, rocks, or cooperative social behavior. These early structures shouldn't be imagined as prehistoric versions of modern homes with individual bedrooms. Many activities still occurred within shared household areas where family members regularly encountered one another. Compared with today's bedroom, privacy remained limited. Compared with an open camp, walls could feel revolutionary. One remarkable example comes from Çatalhöyük, a large Neolithic settlement in what is now Türkiye. At Çatalhöyük, buildings stood extremely close together, creating a settlement very different from scattered temporary camps. Movement through parts of the settlement appears to have involved rooftops rather than ordinary streets between every building. Imagine having neighbors almost directly beside you while solid walls still separated much of your household life. Humans could now achieve visual separation without traveling hundreds of meters away from everyone they knew. Permanent homes could also strengthen associations between particular people, possessions, activities, and specific household spaces. Settled life also increased opportunities to accumulate and store resources rather than carrying everything during frequent movement. As material possessions accumulated, rules surrounding access, ownership, sharing, and household resources could become increasingly important. A wall didn't merely block wind or rain, it could also control who could see particular activities. Where people entered a structure could influence visibility, movement, interaction, and access between household and community spaces. Settlements increasingly created differences between spaces shared widely and spaces associated more closely with particular households. Yet permanent settlement also meant neighbors could remain close for years instead of disappearing when camp moved. Living repeatedly around the same people could make reputation and community expectations increasingly important parts of everyday life. So settled life produced a paradox: architecture increased separation while population density could increase everyday social contact. Privacy wasn't simply appearing for the first time, older social boundaries were becoming combined with increasingly complex architecture. Even with walls, Finn still faced one problem familiar today: sometimes he simply wanted nobody around. So Finn tried humanity's oldest privacy technology again. He walked somewhere quiet and sat completely alone. For a few quiet minutes, Finn had something surprisingly valuable: nobody else demanding his attention. But humans are deeply social, meaning permanent isolation would create problems very different from simply wanting occasional space. Wanting temporary separation from others isn't the same thing as abandoning your community completely. A person might spend time alone and later return to shared food, work, conversation, and companionship. Even highly social communities don't necessarily share every conversation, decision, possession, or piece of personal information equally. Two people could create conversational privacy simply by moving far enough away that others couldn't easily hear. Sometimes distance, lowered voices, and social expectations could accomplish what modern people use closed rooms to achieve. Privacy also depends on cooperation because separation means little if everyone constantly ignores another person's boundaries. In that sense, privacy can function like invisible technology built from expectations rather than stone, wood, or walls. Facial expressions, posture, location, and behavior can all communicate whether somebody welcomes interaction or wants space.
Finn didn't need a sign saying "leave me alone" if everyone understood the social signals around them.
Of course, exactly which signals mattered would depend on cultural expectations that archaeology rarely preserves directly. Nobody can ask a Paleolithic person how much privacy they preferred, making confident universal claims impossible. Archaeologists recover objects, structures, sediments, food remains, and activity traces, not ancient thoughts preserved neatly beside them. Once permanent buildings appeared, researchers gained stronger evidence for how communities physically divided and controlled living space. Walls can prevent outsiders from seeing activities, possessions, and people located inside a household space. Entrances also create places where movement between community space and household space can become socially controlled. That created a meaningful distinction between being among the wider community and entering another household's living space.
A tiny crowded house could still offer remarkably little personal space to the people actually living inside it.
This raises an important question: privacy from strangers, neighbors, relatives, and household members aren't necessarily the same thing. Walls might give an entire household privacy from neighbors while providing little privacy between individuals living together. A settlement itself could also distinguish familiar community members from visitors arriving from somewhere else. So prehistoric privacy probably wasn't one simple yes or no condition, it existed at several overlapping social levels.
The more Finn looked around, the clearer it became: ancient humans didn't necessarily live without boundaries.
They simply created boundaries using different combinations of space, landscape, architecture, relationships, possessions, behavior, and cultural rules. As some communities adopted farming, people increasingly invested time and resources in places they expected to occupy longer. A shelter occupied repeatedly could become something very different from a temporary place used during seasonal movement.
Greater settlement permanence also made accumulating objects easier because everything didn't constantly need to travel with you.
Food and other resources could increasingly be stored within spaces associated with particular households or community groups. Once valuable resources accumulated, communities needed social expectations governing who could access, share, move, or use them. A wall could now separate not only people, but also household resources from the larger community outside. Privacy and property aren't identical, but physical boundaries can influence both visibility and access to valued possessions.
Meanwhile, permanent settlement could place many people within a much smaller area than a mobile landscape allowed.
And unlike a temporary gathering, the same neighboring households might remain beside yours season after season. In a stable community, repeated interaction could make individual behavior increasingly familiar to the people living nearby. Greater population density made architectural separation potentially even more useful for controlling visibility and household access. Over time, some buildings incorporated increasingly differentiated spaces that could support different activities within the same structure. Where walls, passages, and entrances were placed could determine which spaces visitors encountered first and which remained deeper inside. Areas located farther from an entrance could naturally be less visible to people passing through public spaces outside. Buildings don't just protect people from weather, their layouts can influence how humans encounter and avoid one another. None of this means prehistoric families suddenly possessed individual bedrooms matching the expectations of modern households. Household members could still sleep relatively close together, especially where warmth, caregiving, and available space encouraged it.
A person's desired or permitted personal space could also change with age, responsibility, relationships, and social status.
As societies became more socially complex, access to particular spaces could increasingly differ between individuals and groups. More household separation didn't eliminate communal life. People still gathered for work, exchange, food, ceremonies, and conversation. Human settlements increasingly contained a mixture of broadly shared spaces in areas with more restricted household access. Finn could socialize outside, retreat toward his household, or walk beyond the settlement when he wanted solitude.
Architecture didn't invent privacy, it expanded the number of ways people could create and control separation.
Across millennia, human ideas about household space evolved alongside settlement size, architecture, economy, culture, and technology.
Even the strongest wall couldn't create privacy unless other humans understood and respected the boundary it represented. One important truth is that prehistoric humans did not all live in identical camps or follow identical social rules. A forest, desert, coastline, cave, or cold valley could create completely different opportunities for finding personal space. Dense woodland could provide natural visual barriers that an open grassland simply could not offer. On open grasslands, getting out of sight might require considerably more distance or carefully chosen terrain. Cliffs, boulders, and uneven ground could naturally separate people even when no shelter had been deliberately constructed. Large caves sometimes contained corners, chambers, and rock projections that naturally divided occupied areas from one another. A useful shelter could attract many people at once, especially when weather made remaining outside uncomfortable. Bad weather could force everyone closer together, temporarily making personal space less important than warmth and protection. When conditions improved, people could spread out again across a much larger landscape. That means personal space might change with seasons, weather, mobility, resources, and how concentrated a group became. Migration and travel created another challenge, because temporary camps often offered fewer established boundaries than permanent homes. People might sleep close for safety one night, then spread across a different landscape only days later. Each new campsite required people to create fresh social boundaries using the terrain available around them. There was probably never one prehistoric rule explaining exactly how much privacy every human expected or received. Even today, ideas about private rooms, household boundaries, and personal space differ considerably across societies. That suggests privacy isn't simply biological instinct. Culture helps define when separation feels necessary or appropriate. At the same time, humans clearly respond to distance, crowding, attention, relationships, and social boundaries. Even prehistoric Finn probably noticed when someone stood much closer than the situation actually required. A small step backward could instantly create a more comfortable distance without any wall at all. Personal space only works when others recognize and respect the social boundary another person is trying to create. Architecture eventually made those boundaries more visible, durable, and easier to maintain for longer periods. Still, people could create separation long before permanent houses existed by using space, terrain, and social behavior. Probably yes, but asking whether they had modern-style privacy is really asking the wrong question. The better question is how ancient humans created boundaries while living much more closely with other people. They used distance, landscape, social rules, possessions, relationships, shelters, and eventually architecture to create privacy differently. Privacy could mean being unseen, unheard, physically separate, socially respected, or simply left alone for a while. The same person could want company during one moment and solitude only a short time later. Whenever the environment allowed, people could adjust distance from others depending on what they were doing. Some activities happened communally, while others could be performed alone or in much smaller groups. Solitude may also have provided moments for resting, observing, remembering, planning, or simply doing nothing. But living socially also meant people constantly noticed expressions, movements, absences, and changes in one another's behavior. Being noticed meant someone might quickly realize when Finn needed assistance, protection, or simply wasn't around. The same close social attention could also make disappearing quietly for personal space considerably more difficult. Prehistoric life may often have balanced two valuable things: individual space and the security of belonging. During daylight, solitude could feel peaceful; after darkness arrived, being completely alone could feel far less appealing. So Finn's favorite private place still worked best when his community remained somewhere comfortably nearby. Sometimes privacy wasn't about leaving completely, it was about other people choosing not to interrupt. There might be no wall, rope, sign, or door, yet everyone could still understand the boundary. Later, walls and entrances made some boundaries physically visible instead of relying entirely on distance and social understanding. A wall meant little if everyone considered themselves free to enter whenever they wanted. Ancient privacy therefore depended partly on the same thing that supported so much human life: cooperation. There was probably no single moment when humans suddenly decided they wanted private lives. Instead, boundaries changed gradually as group size, mobility, architecture, possessions, relationships, and environments changed too. We can reconstruct spaces and objects,
but the emotions people felt inside those spaces remain mostly invisible. Saying ancient humans had no privacy is probably too simple for something shaped so strongly by culture. If Finn wanted privacy, he didn't necessarily need a bedroom.
He needed a boundary others understood.
Sometimes the boundary was 10 quiet steps away from camp, behind trees, rocks, or another natural feature. Later, that same idea could become a household wall separating family space from the wider community outside. And sometimes the strongest boundary existed only because another human recognized that Finn wanted to be left alone. Ancient humans had privacy not through modern bedrooms, but through space, culture, architecture, relationships, and mutual respect.